"Well, Carly O'Donnell, accept the keys to your new life," said Mrs. Pollak, placing a lightweight set of 3 keys on a metal ring into her narrow palm. The girl hesitated in front of the apartment door, prompting Mrs. Pollak to laugh and unlock the door herself. "Oh, Carly, you're like a newcomer. This is your new apartment. Live, be happy, start a new life. Don't be so timid. Come in." The woman opened the door, nudged Carly into the room, and then closed the door behind them. "I can't believe it, Mrs. Pollak," Carly responded shyly, following the woman down the corridor. "I guess I'm an adult now. I can live as I want and do what I want," the girl said, beginning to grasp what adulthood felt like. "Exactly," Mrs. Pollak said cheerfully, draping an arm around Carly's shoulders. "You're a grown-up now, so you can become independent. But," Mrs. Pollak raised a finger meaningfully, "there's a caveat about doing what you want. My girl," she said in a more serious tone, "being an adult and being in charge of your life doesn't mean you can thoughtlessly do whatever you want. Adulthood means making responsible decisions and always taking responsibility for your life. Understand this. There may be people who will try to sway you with false values and manipulate your thoughts. To distinguish the false from the true, always remember what I've taught you over the years. Do you understand what I'm saying now?" Carly nodded. Mrs. Pollak had indeed been like a mother figure for her and many other children in the orphanage for years. Carly never knew her father, and her memories of her mother were vague and unclear after so many years. Her mother, Lily, was deprived of her parental rights when Carly was just 5 years old. The woman used to disappear for days, leaving young Carly alone without food. If the girl was lucky, she arranged for Mrs. Ross, the neighbour, to look after little Carly during her absences. Attempts to persuade or scold Lily were futile. Hearing her address reproaches, the woman always became furious and began to lash out with profanity at Mrs. Ross, Carly, and the world that tried to force her to deny her desires. And her winning argument, which always worked, was to relentlessly berate her daughter and wish for her to cease being a hindrance to her endless fun. "Curse me for giving birth to this wretched thing," she used to shriek. "I wish she would disappear. Who needs her? She's nothing but a burden who's ruining my life." "What are you saying, you wicked woman?" the neighbour would cry out in horror. "To wish death upon an innocent soul! Come to your senses!" At this point, Carly's mother would always calm down, realizing her manipulation had succeeded, and that she could now freely go on another spree. "What are you, Mrs. Ross? I'm just joking. I mean it metaphorically. You're so kind and helpful. You're always there to assist. I'm not going far, just out for a walk. Sometimes a woman needs a change of scenery. It's not always about home, work, and worries." The cunning woman knew exactly what she was doing. A kind neighbour wouldn't abandon a little girl, so there was no rush to return home. They would manage without her. "I am kind, that's certain," Mrs. Ross responded. "But as for you, Lily, all you seem to do is seek a change of scenery. Your daughter is constantly alone. There's no food in the house. The refrigerator is off. The only food available is some dried-up Snickers bars, which are brought by your drinking buddies on your binge in exchange for your attention." But the mother was unstoppable. Hastily touching up her lips in front of a dull old mirror in the hallway, she used to throw back to the neighbour something like, "Stay out of my private life," and then disappeared in a direction she only knew, not even pausing to look at her daughter. Lily would usually show up on her doorstep a week or 2 later, staggering with the consequences of her reckless lifestyle, and collapse on the old couch, falling into a deep sleep. One day Carly's mother was gone for a month. A concerned neighbour, fearing that she had died, took little Carly by the hand and reported the disappearance to the police. They found the mother shortly after. Somehow, she ended up in a hospital 500 kilometres away from her hometown, suffering from severe booze poisoning. The police, having uncovered the den, found Lily unconscious in the midst of a crowd of similar individuals. Not one of them had noticed her condition. Had a few more days passed, her bender could have resulted in an unnoticed death. The guardianship authorities have initiated the process of terminating Carly's mother's parental rights. Upon regaining consciousness in her hospital bed, she appeared relieved at the news and eagerly signed all necessary papers, looking forward to a free, unrestricted life beyond the hospital. Carly was relocated to an orphanage. Fortunately, the local orphanage was not a grim place. The staff consisted of compassionate women who treated the orphans as their own children. One of the educators, Mrs. Pollak, cheerfully remarked upon seeing Carly, "What a little flame we have here! I have never seen such bright red hair." The girl soon adapted to her new life. Mrs. Pollak did everything she could to help her integrate into their small group, make friends, and feel like a part of their close-knit circle. After leaving the hospital, Carly's mother never once remembered her daughter and never returned home. Eventually, Mrs. Ross received a summons from the police to identify a body which was found on a riverbank. Inside the pocket of a waterlogged, dirty cloak, the police discovered a water-damaged passport belonging to Carly's mother. Mrs. Ross, who came to the identification, crossed herself and looked at the deceased. She could definitely say the body in front of her on the morgue's table was Lily's. Soon she was buried, and from then on, the girl was considered a full orphan. Meanwhile, Carly proved to be a bright and capable child. Mrs. Pollak, a childless and unmarried woman, devoted her life to caring for orphans, and she invested a lot of time in the girl. By the time Carly was school-aged, she was already fluent in reading children's books, showed a keen interest in various subjects, and even dabbled in writing poetry. For her birthday, her teacher gifted her a beautiful glossy album for her poems, which she began filling with her own compositions. A voracious reader, Carly regularly visited the town library. She loved the tranquility and the smell of the books stored there, which led her to aspire to become a librarian. Mrs. Pollak encouraged Carly's love for books and reading at every opportunity. She even decided to create a makeshift library in the orphanage, appointing Carly as the responsible person. The girl was thrilled with the idea. She eagerly started her duties, which included maintaining the books, lending them out, and informing other children about new editions. The orphanage principal regularly purchased new books for the students. "If you want to become a real librarian, you need to be neat and responsible," Mrs. Pollak instructed Carly. "Remember, a librarian's job is to inspire an interest and love for reading." By the time Carly graduated from high school, she knew she wanted to pursue a literature-related degree. The town had a society for book lovers, literature and poetry, which Carly regularly attended. The society comprised amateur poets and writers, who often organized readings of their work. Carly actively participated in these events, and everyone agreed that her future should lay in literature and poetry. One evening, a new individual joined the regular members of the community. His name was Bernard Calhoun, and he was an elderly man, around 70, with a respectful demeanour. He arrived at the community event in a gorgeous, old-style car, chauffeured by a driver, and had a habit of smoking a pipe filled with tobacco. When Carly recited her poems, he clapped the loudest and predicted a successful literary future for her. In town, he was seen as a newcomer. Rumour had it that he had recently moved here from the capital, having bought a house, to exchange the incessant city noise for the tranquillity of a regional suburb. One evening, Mr. Calhoun invited the attendees to his mansion after the event to celebrate his birthday. While some were eager to return home and others had other commitments, a few, including Carly, were delighted to accept Mr. Calhoun's invitation. In the living room of his rather spacious house, there was already a table set with champagne. Carly, who was 17 at that moment, had never tasted alcohol, but when a thin glass filled with gold and sparkling drink was placed in front of her, she found it inconvenient to refuse. The evening passed in a warm and sincere atmosphere. The host himself drank only mineral water, referring to the fact that doctors had categorically forbidden it. When Carly returned to the orphanage, Mrs. Pollak smelled a slight odour of champagne and became alarmed. When it turned out where the girl had been, she gave her a whole lecture about not trusting all men. Among them, there are vicious lovers of young girls, from whom one should stay as far away as possible. However, soon Mr. Calhoun himself paid a visit to the orphanage and asked permission from those responsible for the girl to let Carly help him sort out the extensive library in his house. "I heard that Carly aspires to have a career in librarianship," he told the director and the tutor, settling into a chair in the director's office. "And now I see where your student gets her love for books and reading," he remarked, observing the tall shelves lining the wall filled with books. The women remained cautiously silent. Mr. Calhoun's sudden interest in Carly aroused suspicion in them. Detecting this, the man chuckled and reassured them. "I understand your skepticism, but you have no cause for concern. I just wish to help a talented girl achieve her dream. She truly has a passion for librarianship. I've never seen a young girl so engrossed, not in fashion and cosmetics, but in books and reading. I have 2 grandchildren myself, but sadly, their interests are entirely different. As for Carly, it would be very useful for her to participate in such an endeavour. My library has amassed thousands of books over many years, some of which are quite rare and valuable." On hearing that the unexpected visitor had grandchildren of his own, the women relaxed slightly. However, the headmistress, casting a serious gaze at him, began to speak. "We certainly don't mind Carly participating in such activities, especially as she's preparing to enter the college next year. But rest assured, we will always keep an eye on her and protect her," the headmistress added sternly. "Well, I see the future is in safe hands," Mr. Calhoun joked in response. "You're absolutely right to take this matter seriously, so you don't have to worry in vain. I'll install a surveillance camera in my library, so you can see what Carly is doing in my house at any time. What do you think?" "Let's give it a try," the orphanage director agreed, looking relieved. When Carly heard about the upcoming opportunity, she was thrilled. Mr. Calhoun's house was filled with books, and the chance to go through them was a dream come true for her. Carly mainly helped Mr. Calhoun on weekends. She woke up early in the morning and rushed to his house to immerse herself in the vast world of books, of which his library had plenty. Mr. Calhoun typically awaited her with breakfast ready. Carly found it unusual to sit at a table with starched napkins and expensive dishes, while the housekeeper served her tea and hot pancakes with jam. However, Mr. Calhoun was an engaging and knowledgeable conversationalist, and Carly would quickly forget her surroundings, engrossed in another captivating discussion. Mrs. Pollak, on the other hand, monitored how Carly spent her time closely. "Carly, you are an adult now," she told the girl. "Soon you will start living independently. Of course, you can always rely on me, but decisions about your relationships, especially with men, will be yours alone to make. Always prioritize your own desires and interests. Never give in to pressure, especially when you're being forced to do something you don't want. Don't agree to such things, even if you're offered money for it. If you encounter such people, run away." Carly understood who Mrs. Pollak was warning her about, but Mr. Calhoun had never behaved in such a manner. On the contrary, he acted like a genuinely caring grandfather, as if he were Carly's own kin. The girl, who had never had a grandfather, or even a father, appreciated this approach. Mr. Calhoun liked to ask her opinion on various life situations. They even occasionally disagreed and argued over differing viewpoints. Mrs. Pollak was perplexed by the friendship between Carly and Mr. Calhoun, suspecting ulterior motives in their interactions. However, no matter how closely she observed, she found nothing suspicious. The day arrived when Carly, her long-time student with bright red curls, was to become completely independent of those who genuinely cared for her. As Mrs. Pollak stood in Carly's apartment, she realized that her pupil was not entirely ready for adult life. But what could she do? Carly couldn't stay in the orphanage, and it was time for her to mature. "Well, Carly, are you ready to run the household?" Mrs. Pollak asked cheerfully, surveying the apartment. "I've arranged for you a place of a saleswoman while you're preparing for the college." Picking up a large zippered bag from the floor, she placed it on a stool and opened it. "We collected some dishes and bedding for you. Use them, and then buy whatever else you need." Mrs. Pollak chatted, her tone deliberately upbeat, but Carly could tell the woman was hiding her worry behind the chatter. "Mrs. Pollak, don't worry, I'm not going anywhere. We'll see each other every day, just like before," the girl reassured her. "How can I not worry? For so many years you were so close, and now how will it all work out?" Mrs. Pollak mourned. "Well, you're right, there's nothing to worry about. I have to go, Carly. I have a lot to do today." The women hugged each other, then Carly shut the door behind Mrs. Pollak. A new life indeed, the girl thought, unpacking her belongings. Suddenly her phone started to ring. Mr. Calhoun had learned that it was Carly's birthday and insisted on giving her a personal gift, a new smartphone. "No refusals accepted," he said, noticing the girl's hesitation to accept the gift. "After all, I need to stay in touch with my assistant. What's so odd about that?" Carly answered the call, and it was Mr. Calhoun, requesting her to come over that day. She promised to arrive soon, right after unpacking and getting settled in her new place. About 3 hours later, Carly was stepping into the hallway of Mr. Calhoun's mansion. The master was sitting by the fireplace in the drawing room, engrossed in a book and puffing on a pipe of tobacco. "Well, how have you settled in?" he asked as Carly walked in. "Come in, sit down, and tell me, as well, where you decided to work before entering the college." Carly sighed and told the store where Mrs. Pollak had arranged a position for her. "Actually, I don't want to work there, but where else can I go?" she said. "You don't have to work at the store if you don't want to," Mr. Calhoun replied. "In fact, I have something to offer you. How would you feel about working for me? You do the same thing you're doing now, sorting my library, helping me catalogue, and occasionally keeping me company. We're friends, aren't we?" Carly smiled happily. She liked the sound of his offer. However, remembering Mrs. Pollak's cautionary words, she asked, "That would be great. Thank you for your care and consideration. But, Mr. Calhoun, why are you showing me such kindness? After all, you have your own grandchildren, and you probably have children too. You never talk about them." "Carly, girl," Mr. Calhoun began thoughtfully, seeming to decide something. "I've wanted to talk to you for a while, and now I believe the time has come. Look," he said, taking out a photograph and handing it to her. It was a picture of a young man with fiery red curly hair. Carly, puzzled, looked at the picture, clearly perplexed as to why Mr. Calhoun was showing it to her. "Is this likely a relative of yours? Perhaps a son or grandson?" "Well, not a grandson," Mr. Calhoun laughed in response. "But you're right, he is my own son," he said, his tone suddenly serious. "A son who unfortunately made many mistakes in his life and has now left this world. Alas." "What happened to him?" the girl asked sympathetically. "The story is not a happy one," Mr. Calhoun replied. "Perhaps I, as a father, didn't pay enough attention to my son. I left his upbringing to my wife and various nannies," the man said, shaking his head sorrowfully. "I'm wealthy, very wealthy. I inherited a large, successful business from my father, which I have expanded throughout my life. However, I overlooked that there was no one to pass it on to. When I was younger, I foolishly believed that earning money and increasing wealth were the most important things. I missed out on a lot, not understanding the significance of a father's role in raising his child. My only son grew into a complete egotist, having been accustomed since childhood to the world revolving around him. His mother pampered him with luxury and attention, never demanding anything in return. As a result, he grew up believing that everyone owed him something, and he owed nothing to anyone. I should have noticed and made an impact, but I was always busy with business. And there's nothing I can do about it now. The path my son chose led him to ruin. The old man sighed and fell silent. Carly listened patiently, sympathizing with him, but she didn't understand the purpose of the conversation. After a brief silence, Mr. Calhoun continued. From a young age, my only son, Richie, led a destructive and aimless life, with access to unlimited funds. He was introduced to alcohol, debauchery, and illegal substances early on. By 18, he was already an alcoholic, succumbing to every temptation and frequently losing control. When I finally realized the extent of his problems, it was too late. His mother, my wife, had been covering up his wrongdoings. I only learned about his lifestyle much later, and from strangers. Disagreements over our son led to frequent fights between my wife and me, ending in our divorce. She moved out afterward, demanding a separate residence for herself and her son, as well as substantial monthly support. This move effectively ended any influence I have over our Richie. After a while, I was informed by my ex-wife that Richie was getting married. Unfortunately, his chosen partner was nothing more than a gold digger. Richie's lifestyle remained unchanged after the wedding. I attempted to explain to him that he needed to alter his ways now that he was a husband and a family man. Much to my disappointment, my advice was met with laughter from him. "None of your business," Richie said to me disdainfully. This conversation took place in the morning, following a night of heavy drinking. Just a few hours earlier, my son had been barely able to stand, his breath reeking of alcohol. "Getting married wasn't my idea, it was Megan's. She wanted to get married, and I agreed just for kicks," he laughed, his voice thick with drunken glee. His young wife Megan was pregnant. It seemed that she did not care about her husband's lifestyle. Their marriage lasted a little over 3 years, during which Megan had another child. Decided that now she was quite well providing for herself at the expense of future alimony for 2 children, she calmly filed for divorce, and Richie didn't care about it. Following the divorce, I purchased a separate apartment for Richie's ex-wife and their 2 children. My son went on with his previous lifestyle, swiftly bringing home a new girlfriend who was as much of a drinker as he was. His apartment had turned into a haven for debauchery. I was constantly receiving complaints from neighbours and made numerous attempts to appeal to my son's conscience. Once, I was solemnly informed that Richie's new girlfriend was pregnant. Despite her condition, she sat next to him smoking a cigarette, laughing drunkenly and sipping potent alcohol. "Dad, you must join us in a toast to celebrate your soon-to-be grandson," insisted Richie, pouring a generous measure of brandy for me. But I realized one thing. If my son's girlfriend was really pregnant, then I had to save my future grandson. Under the pretext of getting acquainted with the future mother, I took her out into the corridor and drove her straight to the hospital. She snored in the back seat throughout the journey, seemingly unconcerned about her destination. Upon arrival at the hospital, she was brought to her senses and put to sleep. I spoke with the doctor beforehand and learned that she was really pregnant. The next day, I picked up the young woman from the hospital and brought her to my home, where she would be cared for by 2 nurses and a housekeeper. By the way, her name was Lily. When Lily realized her wild days were over, she made a fuss, refusing to live under supervision and demanding to be released immediately. However, I remained resolute. "Listen, Lily," I addressed her, "here's the plan. You will stay with me for a few months, everything provided, no alcohol or tobacco. If you behave, you'll live like royalty. After you give birth, you're free to leave, but the baby stays here. In exchange, I'll pay you a generous sum, and hopefully that will be the end of our dealings." The amount of money she would receive clearly captured her imagination. It seemed that she was mentally calculating how many bottles could be bought with this money. So she stayed in my house. Of course, I accepted the fact that she might not have been pregnant with my son. Given her lifestyle, she might not remember all her partners. Regardless, I resolved to protect this child, no matter who the father was. "So, this girl has given you another grandchild?" Carly asked. "No, unfortunately," replied the old man. "Lily managed to escape from my house shortly before her due date. She had tried repeatedly to persuade the staff to set her free, but to no avail. Then tragedy struck. My son was poisoned and died in the hospital. His ex-wife learned at his funeral that Lily had been living in my house and was soon to give birth to my grandchild. She realized this child would be the 3rd heir to my wealth, and she decided to eliminate the competition. I couldn't figure out why Megan suddenly started visiting my house under various pretenses and regularly brought over my grandchildren, who hadn't remembered me for months. I don't know how she did it, but one morning Lily's room was empty. Both nurses were asleep beside her. The housekeeper and I couldn't wake them. They were clearly drugged. "But did you find Lily afterwards?" Carly asked hopefully. "I didn't find her immediately," Mr. Calhoun sighed in response. "The girl had simply vanished. It was as if she never existed. I hired a detective to search for Lily nationwide. After all, it was uncertain whether Lily, considering her lifestyle, could survive on her own and give birth to a child. It wasn't until several years later that I found a lead in a small town. But by then it was too late. Lily was no longer alive." "And the child? Was he or she found?" Carly asked Mr. Calhoun impatiently, who had become quiet and seemed lost in thought. "We succeeded in our search, but also not immediately. Lily gave birth to a daughter." Mr. Calhoun smiled in reply. "In the town where Lily was buried, she was a stranger, leading a nomadic life. No one had ever seen a child with her, and no one could confirm whether she had a child or not. I had already assumed that Lily had never given birth or had given birth to a stillborn child, which wouldn't be surprising given her lifestyle. But it turned out that there had indeed been a baby." Mr. Calhoun's voice quivered with excitement. "Lily had given birth while living in another town. There, she was deprived of parental rights, and the child, a little daughter, was placed in an orphanage. I couldn't believe that the search had been successful, so I decided to see for myself. When I saw the girl, all my doubts about the paternity of my son disappeared instantly. The girl was an exact copy of Richie." Mr. Calhoun fell silent, overcome with emotion. Carly waited patiently. Finally, the elderly man, having composed himself, continued. "I didn't reveal myself immediately. Instead, I observed the girl for over a year. The more I watched her, the more convinced I became. Thankfully, my granddaughter did not take after her father, but rather, it seemed, me. She was a talented, clever, good girl. She was so different from my other 2 grandchildren, raised by their mother, the gold-digger Megan, and my ex-wife. They valued nothing but money. They were petty, wicked, and incompetent. I always knew that if something happened to me, I wouldn't trust my business with them. But now I am at peace." Mr. Calhoun said with a contented smile. "Now I know who my successor can be, and I am so proud of her. Do you want to know who this girl is?" Mr. Calhoun asked slyly. Intrigued by his story, the girl eagerly nodded in response. With a solemn pause, the old man looked at her again and said, "It is you, Carly." "How can it be me?" Carly, taken aback, continued to gaze at the elderly man in surprise. "I don't understand anything," she muttered. "Carly, it's true," laughed Mr. Calhoun. "You are my granddaughter. I realized it the minute I first saw you. Who else could have such fiery red hair? You're one of us." "I am the granddaughter you told me about, right?" exclaimed the girl in surprise. "And you are my grandfather?" The elderly man silently and excitedly nodded in response to Carly's realization. "And you're right, my mum's name is Lily. I don't know my dad and grew up in an orphanage when my mum was deprived of parental rights. So it turns out that's right." The girl could hardly contain her joy. "Mr. Calhoun, are you really my grandpa?" Carly, casting aside any remaining doubts, lovingly embraced her grandfather. Mr. Calhoun also radiated happiness. "But why did you only tell me about this now?" she asked. "Well, there are reasons for that," the man replied seriously. "When I found you and got to know you, I hadn't yet understood your way of life. I was afraid that such news might upset you, given your settled life, but I was certain you were my granddaughter. Hair colour is a family treasure. My other two grandchildren have inherited that hair colour too, and your dad, my son, was also a fiery redhead. However, we need to have a serious talk, my granddaughter." Mr. Calhoun suddenly shifted his tone. "Unfortunately, I am very ill. Doctors predict only 2 or 3 more years for me, and that's if I lead a quiet, measured life free from worry and anxiety. There's no need to cry," he said, noting that the girl was quite upset by the news. "You are the heiress of our family, and we have always been strong, self-confident people. Our son Richie might not be cut from the same cloth, but you are definitely one of us," Mr. Calhoun declared proudly. "And I didn't start this discussion without reason. As I've mentioned, I want to ensure that I'm passing our family business into reliable hands. Now I see that those hands should be yours." "Wait, don't argue, please," he continued, seeing that his granddaughter was about to say something. "I realize you still have much to learn, and even if something happens to me, you should know that we have a few reliable and time-tested people in our business who will be your support at first. I'm confident you will handle everything, as you possess the most important trait, our family's character. And of course, I am not planning to die just yet. On the contrary, I intend to live on." "Grandfather, I don't need anything from you," Carly exclaimed. "The main thing is that I have you now. Won't your other grandchildren take offence and hate me if you give me your family business?" "Carly, don't worry about such things," Grandfather replied. "You are my successor now, and that's a great responsibility. As for your half-brother and sister, my other grandchildren, they will receive their share in my will. They're not interested in our business. They only care about the money. Sadly, their mother Megan, my son's ex-wife, and my ex-wife Bella instilled these values in them. I regret not intervening." The elderly man paused for a moment and then continued. "By the way, you'll soon meet them. After deciding to talk to you, I called them yesterday from the capital. They're on their way and should arrive soon." "Mr. Calhoun, dinner is ready," announced the housekeeper as she entered the living room in a neat white apron. "May I serve?" she asked, pausing in the centre of the room. After receiving approval, she vanished, leaving behind the low, tinkling sounds of dishes from the dining room. Soon, the grandfather and granddaughter sat down for dinner. They discussed Carly's upcoming introduction to the other family members. When the housekeeper served tea, a bell rang in the hallway. The master instructed her to answer the door as he poured the fragrant hot tea into delicate porcelain cups. 2 visitors, a young man in his 20s and a woman around 25, both with fiery red hair, entered the dining room. The newcomers were visibly taken aback at the sight of Carly. They exchanged glances as the grandfather greeted them and introduced Carly as a new family member. The artificial kindness of their smiles failed to mask their unpleasant expressions when Carly shook hands with them. The brother was named Lucas and the sister Gia. Having recently eaten lunch on their journey, Lucas and Gia declined the meal but joined the grandfather and Carly for tea. They curiously asked the girl about her life. Upon discovering her talent for literature and poetry, they requested to hear her poems. Mr. Calhoun watched his grandchildren with a contented smile, not hiding his pleasure. As evening fell, and Carly prepared to leave to her apartment, Mr. Calhoun regretfully bid his granddaughter goodbye, securing a promise that she would return the next day. After Mr. Calhoun retired to his study to read and smoke a pipe before bed, the brother and sister sat on the couch by the fireplace and conversed in hushed tones. "Lucas, do you understand what's happening?" Gia whispered. "Remember, Mum told us about our father's girlfriend, so she did give birth to a child." Gia stated with disgust. "Have you noticed how excited Grandad is around her? He never acts like this with us. We might have to share our inheritance with her. I bet she'll try to take some of our money," she continued spitefully. Upon hearing the word money, Lucas jumped up. "Do you think he'll give everything to her?" he asked Gia doubtfully. "Who knows?" Gia replied. "But one thing is clear. We need to get rid of this orphan, no matter what it takes." The next day, everyone gathered once more in Mr. Calhoun's living room. After dinner, the grandfather thanked the housekeeper, who had started to clear the table. Turning to his 3 grandchildren, he said, "Good. You've all met. I'm delighted. From now on, Carly is as much a part of our family as you, Gia, and Lucas. To better acquaint yourselves, you should spend more time together. Go out, have fun, and Carly, I'll expect you tomorrow. We still need to sort out the library," said Mr. Calhoun, wrapping an arm around his granddaughter's shoulders. "Go enjoy yourselves. I have some business to attend to," he added before heading to his office. When he left, Gia turned to Carly, her tone deliberately cheerful. "So, any ideas? You know your town better than we do. Where should we go first?" Carly pondered for a moment before suggesting, "How about the local history museum?" Though she suggested it hesitantly, she was certain her brother and sister would hardly find a museum visit interesting. Lucas and Gia exchanged meaningful glances. The sister then discreetly nudged her brother and nodded towards Carly, saying, "What a wonderful idea, don't you think, Lucas? I find museums so fascinating." "Yes, it's a great idea," Lucas replied, feigning excitement. "We should definitely visit the local history museum. By the way, why don't you invite us to your home? Our grandfather encouraged us to get to know each other better, so we're interested in your life," he added. "And we'd like to visit you right away. Could you serve us tea, like a proper hostess?" "Of course," Carly replied, beginning to think that her new relatives might not be as self-serving and as petty as her grandfather had suggested. They all got into Lucas's car and headed to Carly's place. Along the way, Carly, realizing she had nothing to offer them at her home, suggested they stop at a store. The siblings agreed enthusiastically. When Gia and Lucas loaded the food into the cart and approached the cash register, Carly expressed concern that she might not have enough money to cover the cost, and most of all, she was troubled by the expensive bottle of whiskey that Lucas had chosen, explaining that they needed to celebrate their reunion. "Relax, Carly," he assured her. "We'll cover the cost. Your role is to keep us company and set the table like a true hostess." Soon the siblings were at Carly's apartment, and Gia looked around with barely concealed contempt. "Very nice and cosy." "Really, Lucas?" she said, casting a glance at Carly, who was busy setting out the snacks they had bought at the store. Once everything was prepared, Lucas opened the bottle of whiskey. "We should toast to our reunion," he said, pouring the drinks. "I don't drink," Carly protested, watching as Lucas poured a generous amount of alcohol into her glass. "I've only tried champagne once in my life, and I didn't like it," she added doubtfully. "Carly, are you kidding? You don't drink at all?" "Never," Lucas said with conviction. "Well, that's right, of course, but you have us now, your family, and such a behaviour is disrespectful, especially since we're your guests." Lucas made a hurt face. "Carly, Lucas is right. You should show us respect. Maybe you don't know this, but there are certain rules for hosts' behaviour towards their guests. It's an excellent drink, and it's easy to drink. Have at least a few sips with us, out of respect." Lucas had already proposed the first toast to the meeting. Carly took a small sip and realized that the drink was indeed easy to swallow and had a mild taste. "Well, you see, and you didn't want to drink with us," exclaimed her half-brother, immediately refilling the glasses with a new serving of alcohol. "And now, let's drink to the addition to our family. To you, Carly." He solemnly proposed a new toast, not giving the girl a second to think. Through a haze, the girl realized that the drink was much stronger than she first thought. Her head hummed, the room swayed like a boat trip on the water. Mrs. Pollak, the educator, arranged small river trips on an excursion boat for her students from time to time. For a moment, Carly felt like she was standing on the deck during one of these excursions. She took the glass filled by her brother with another serving of the intoxicating drink. "Drink!" she heard, the words echoing in her head like they were bouncing off the walls of a deep stone well. Carly, teetering on the brink of unconsciousness, felt an unwelcome liquid being poured down her throat. Unable to swallow, she coughed. "Quiet!" Gia hissed at her brother. "She could choke. God forbid. You'll answer to Grandpa for her. Remember, she left with us." "Calm down. Everything's under control," Lucas reassured in a muffled tone, keeping a close eye on Carly. "She seems ready." "Let's call Grandpa, Carly," he announced, and pulling out her phone, dialed Grandpa's number with a sly grin. "Now, sister, tell Grandpa how much you love him. Go on." He thrust the phone in front of Carly's face. The girl struggled to open her eyes and looked at the screen. Upon seeing her grandfather, she giggled and managed to slur, "Grandpa? Hi, it's me." "Carly, what's wrong? Are you sick?" Her grandfather's voice filled with alarm. "No, I'm very well. We've just had a bit to drink." Carly slurred, swayed, and collapsed on the floor, falling asleep instantly. Mr. Calhoun ended the call. The brother and sister looked at each other, laughed, and high-fived. Their plan had worked. Now their grandfather would think twice about making any decision, having seen what his beloved new granddaughter was capable of. Meanwhile, Mr. Calhoun was truly upset and thought about what he had seen. Had he misjudged Carly, attributing to her qualities that his granddaughter did not possess? Was she going to follow in her parents' footsteps? "I must go to her at once," he finally decided, pressing the bell to summon the houseworker. But suddenly the elderly man felt a crushing pain in his sternum. He staggered, nearly losing consciousness. With a significant effort, he managed to stay upright. Soon his housekeeper arrived in response to his summons. "Hurry!" he whispered with the last of his strength.
Tell the chauffeur to get the car. We need to leave immediately."
Then he lost consciousness. Carly opened her eyes with difficulty, taking in her surroundings with surprise. She was lying on her couch at home. A table nearby held the remnants of appetizers, upturned glasses, and an empty bottle on its side. Attempting to get up, she felt a wave of dizziness. "What happened? What's wrong with me?" She tried to understand, but to no avail. Her memory returned abruptly, hitting her like a wave of ice. My brother and sister, they were here at my place. We were celebrating our reunions. With difficulty, Carly turned her head to look at the wall clock. It was 6 a.m. How long did I sleep? The girl wondered, realizing the feast must have lingered into the evening. She couldn't recall what had happened. A strange, unpleasant taste lingered in her mouth. Did I drink alcohol? She pondered, remembering her siblings had brought alcohol the previous day. Feeling unwell, Carly forced herself to get up, went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. The sight of the previous day's appetizers left on the plates induced waves of nausea. She had no appetite. After drinking tea, Carly cleared the table, set the alarm clock for 9 a.m. and went back to sleep on the sofa. Upon waking, she took a shower, but had no desire for breakfast. She began preparing for her visit to her grandfather's house. Usually, she would arrive there by 10 a.m. They would have breakfast, drink coffee, and then Carly would sort out her grandfather's library. Today, she knew she would arrive later than usual. Dialing his number, she planned to inform him that she will be late. However, there was no answer on her grandfather's phone. An hour later, she found the house empty too. "Where is the grandfather?" Carly asked the housekeeper, puzzled. "Don't you know?" the woman replied, surprised, as she cleaned the book racks. "Mr. Calhoun is in the hospital in serious condition. He's in intensive care. Miss Calhoun and her brother are with him at the hospital." Upon hearing this, Carly felt a chill. That's why her grandfather hadn't answered her call. She rushed to the hospital immediately. However, due to his serious condition, she was not allowed to visit him. Not knowing what else to do, she sat on a couch in the hallway. "There she is. Have you come to see the result of your inappropriate behaviour?" Suddenly, Carly heard someone's voice beside her. Looking up, Carly saw Gia and Lucas standing in front of her. "Yes, it's your fault that grandfather got sick," Gia exclaimed. "Why is it my fault? What happened?" Carly did not understand. "Look at this." Lucas, feigning indignation, pulled out his phone, turned it on, and shoved it in Carly's face. On the screen, Carly saw herself, barely coherent, and holding a glass at the table. "Do you like what you see?" Lucas asked mockingly. "There's more where that came from if you're not too ashamed to watch," he continued, scrolling through his phone. "Has Grandpa seen all this?" Carly was horrified. "Why did you show him all this? He shouldn't be worried at all," she said, shocked. "And now she blames us," Gia responded indignantly. "You were the one who video called him yesterday. He got sick when he saw the state you were in. You're just like your mother, an alcoholic and a total loser. Leave before we throw you out. We don't want to see you here again," Gia said angrily to Carly. "Yes," her brother said snidely. "It may happen to everyone, but if I were you, I wouldn't show my face here again. If you have even a shred of conscience left, you'd better leave nicely and forget you're our sister." Stunned by the news, Carly silently left the hospital lobby. She couldn't comprehend how she could have done such a thing. "Maybe they are deceiving me," Carly thought, "but how can I find out now? Even if they were lying about the video call, they have proof that I had been drinking alcohol that night. This means my granddad will see it anyway, and in his situation, it's unacceptable to worry now. The thought of never seeing her grandfather again filled Carly with dread. Uncertain of what to do next, she headed to the orphanage. Whenever she was in trouble or didn't understand a situation, she knew exactly whom to seek help from. The girl headed to Mrs. Pollak, but suddenly realized that she hadn't informed her teacher about her new-founded relatives yet. Events had unfolded so quickly that Carly hadn't had the chance to share this news with the woman who had become like family to her. Meanwhile, the teacher was, as always, at her workspace. She was delighted to see Carly, but quickly realized that the visit was not for casual conversation. Carly recounted the events of the past few days, leaving Mrs. Pollak surprised.
Life is as unpredictable as any movie. No one saw this coming.
I don't know what to do, Mrs. Pollak, Carly admitted after finishing her story. I'm afraid my grandfather will think poorly of me. As for this inheritance, I said at once that I didn't need anything. But my grandfather thinks that I am the right person to succeed him in the family business. My half-brother and sister don't seem thrilled about me being viewed as the heir to their grandfather's fortune. I suspect they may have set up the drinking incident to embarrass me in front of him.
Carly, talk to them about it, Mrs. Pollak said heatedly. Promise them you'll renounce everything when it comes to the inheritance, and perhaps they'll leave you alone. However, I think if they are such petty people, it's better to have no relatives at all.
I will try to talk to them, carefully replied doubtfully, but I'm not sure if they'll believe me. When grandfather spoke of them, he didn't have flattering things to say. He claimed they only cared about money, and they judge others by their own standards, so most likely they would want to get complete assurance that I won't claim anything.
Then you should try explaining everything to your grandfather, Mrs. Pollak suggested. After all, he's still in charge, she added confidently.
Carly nodded and, after saying goodbye, left Mrs. Pollak. She decided to speak to her relatives again and headed back to the hospital. Unfortunately, she was still not allowed to see her grandfather, and Gia and Lucas were nowhere to be found. She learned from the nurse at the reception that they had recently gone home. Determined to confront them, Carly set off for her grandfather's house. Gia and Lucas were having lunch in their grandfather's dining room. After the housekeeper cleared the soup dishes and brought out the main course, they began to eat and discuss the current situation.
So, what now? Lucas asked, biting into a roasted turkey leg. So, our sis has been neutralized, and we can ease up.
I doubt that, Gia replied, dabbing her lips with a starched napkin. We can't predict what grandfather will do when he recovers. Remember, as soon as he came to, he called for the notary at the hospital. She shook her head meaningfully. What that means we still don't know. Perhaps he decided to change something in our favour, Lucas suggested. Why? Are we already considered the main heirs? Gia objected. The most important thing is that our grandfather kept seeing her as the irresponsible daughter of his alcoholic mother. She succumbed to the allure of alcohol just like her mother. How can he trust her with the family business? But we weren't going to be trusted with the family business either, said the brother. Lucas, why do we even need it? Said his sister in response. We just want the inheritance. Then we can sell the business, split the money, and that's it. Their discussion was interrupted by an unexpected ring at the door. The housekeeper went to answer it, and Carly walked into the dining room a minute later. Here she is, our cheerful sister, Lucas exclaimed upon seeing her. I must speak to you, said Carly firmly. Hear me out. Go ahead, talk, said Gia, as the eldest, not even considering inviting her sister to sit. Carly stood before her relatives, as if she were a guilty schoolgirl. Grandfather was right about them, she thought, and spoke up. I want you to hear me, now. I don't want your fortune. Understand? You probably arranged this drinking affair deliberately to present me negatively in front of our grandfather. Remember this, I never drank.
I don't drink, and I will not start drinking, no matter who my mother is. So I don't want Grandpa to think poorly of me, and I'm going to explain the situation to him. You just stay out of my way." "Well, look at her," Gia responded in feigned surprise. "She's showing a character, acting like she's a worthy descendant of our family." "Remember this, you're nobody," Gia said harshly. "You will not talk to my grandfather, understand? What's the guarantee you won't harm him and take his entire fortune? We don't want to be left with nothing." "He was right about you," Carly answered confidently. "You only value money in life. What if I give you my word that I'll renounce everything?" The brother and sister glanced at each other and burst into laughter. "Either you're mentally ill or too cunning," Gia scoffed. "Who in their right mind would voluntarily give up a huge fortune? Enough with your games," she concluded decisively. "You're going to leave here and never return. If you disobey, know that Grandfather will see other videos Lucas filmed during the feast. And as you said, we wouldn't let our grandfather worry," Gia added in a mocking tone. The phone rang in the hallway. The housekeeper answered it, and after a brief conversation hung up. Entering the dining room, she said, "The hospital called. Mr. Calhoun has passed away. His heart stopped and the doctor's efforts failed." "What news?" Lucas exclaimed in surprise. "Unexpected?" "Well, that's it," said Gia decisively, turning to Carly. "You can't speak to him any more, so there's no need for you to stay here. I hope you haven't changed your mind about the inheritance. Are you still refusing it, as you assured us earlier? Yes or no?" "I don't want anything from you," Carly cried out bitterly. "Poor grandfather, how could this happen? I just found out about you, and now I've lost you." She began to sob. "How touching. I'm going to cry too," Lucas remarked cynically. "Okay, if we've settled everything, then goodbye," said Gia, ignoring Carly's tears. "And by the way, don't you dare show up at the funeral. You have no place there. And my advice to you, forget this whole story soon," she added coldly. Overwhelmed with grief, Carly left her grandfather's house. She didn't know how to continue living, blaming herself for her grandfather's death. Her half-brother and sister's actions were cruel, and she was lost. Unable to cope with the grief herself, she called Mrs. Pollak and, sobbing, managed to tell her what had happened. "Oh, my poor girl, how many troubles have you had in such a short life? I'm very sorry to hear of your grandfather's death. Accept my condolences. But, you know, if I were you, I would still go to the funeral," Mrs. Pollak advised confidently. "You're as much as a grandchild as your brother and sister, even if you decided to renounce your inheritance. You have the right to say goodbye to your grandfather. At the hospital, you were kept away from him by your half-sibling's wishes. However, I still don't understand why you chose not to accept the inheritance. It was wrong of you to go along with their demands," the educator added. Carly didn't answer. She just thanked her teacher for her advice and support and hung up the phone. When she got to her apartment, she immediately went to bed and fell into a deep sleep. Carly's grandfather's funeral was in 3 days. After some consideration, Carly agreed with Mrs. Pollak's point of view. No one had the authority to prevent her from bidding farewell to her grandfather. She called her grandfather's residence and asked the housekeeper to share the time and location of the funeral. Despite the young owners having forbidden the staff from allowing Carly into the house or even communicating with her, the housekeeper secretly informed Carly about the funeral arrangements. The woman was not fond of the young masters. They had started behaving disrespectfully and rudely towards her, even before they had fully assumed their roles as heirs. Neither Mr. Calhoun nor Carly had ever allowed themselves such behaviour. Sincerely thanking the housekeeper, the girl resolved to attend the funeral. At the designated time, she arrived at the funeral home, striving to attract minimal attention and to avoid being seen by Gia and Lucas. The ceremony was already in progress. During the service, Carly stood at the back, attempting to glimpse her grandfather in the coffin over the heads of the mourners. She spotted Gia and Lucas immediately in the front row. The room was filled with other people, relatives, friends and associates of Mr. Calhoun. Gia periodically turned around to whisper with two women shrouded in black. Those must be her mother and grandmother, grandfather's ex-wife, Carly thought. Finally, the ceremony concluded, and it was time for the farewell. Gia and Lucas, showing profound grief, were the first to approach the coffin, followed by the other attendees. After the siblings left the room, Carly looked around, then cautiously approached the coffin. As she looked at her grandfather, she couldn't hold back her tears. Suddenly, Carly noticed a suspicious stare directed at her. An elderly lady in a mourning hat with a veil, who had been standing next to Gia and Lucas during the ceremony, was eyeing her warily. Eventually, the woman approached Carly and said angrily, "Aren't you the alleged granddaughter of my ex-husband, who has just appeared from nowhere? Do you think being a redhead makes you the heir? Perhaps you've dyed your hair," she shouted angrily. "What's the matter, Grandma?" Gia and Lucas appeared nearby. "Look, a snake has shown up after all," hissed the half-sister, noticing Carly. "Get out! Lucas, help me!" The relatives grabbed Carly under her arms and forcefully dragged her towards the exit. Once outside, the relatives tossed Carly onto the ground. "That's it!" Gia bent down and sternly said to Carly's face, "It seems you don't understand words, so know this. The inheritance is ours, always has been and will continue to be, and you, as you've always been a nobody, will remain so. If I ever see you again, it will be your own fault. You'll regret it, I promise. We won't hesitate to do anything, you know." Relatives seated in the hearse, the coffin containing my grandfather's body, were sealed and placed in the back. The hearse then proceeded to the cemetery. Carly, struggling, rose to her feet and set off for home. Her relatives' worry was misplaced. She had no intention of claiming the inheritance and wasn't interested in the details of her grandfather's will. The following day went by in a haze. Carly called grandfather's housekeeper to inquire about his burial location. However, the woman insisted she refrain from visiting the cemetery yet, as the new owners had strictly forbidden her from revealing the burial site. The will would be read the next day. Once all the relatives returned to the capital, leaving the housekeeper in charge, she and Carly could visit Mr. Calhoun's grave. Grateful, Carly ended the call with the housekeeper. She had to settle her life, so pulling herself together, she got a job at the store that Mrs. Pollak had mentioned. However, when the next day the will was read out by the notary, the relatives were stunned. What they heard upon after the opening of the sealed envelope left them bewildered and incensed. "This is outrageous! It can't be!" the relatives all shouted simultaneously. Overwhelmed by what she had heard, Mr. Calhoun's ex-wife collapsed onto the floor. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, quiet down," interjected the notary. "Everything is legal. I have substantial proof that the late Mr. Calhoun instructed me about his will in the presence of witnesses, while he was of sound mind. Besides all the documents, I also have a video of the process filmed by a specially appointed person. Plus, I must warn you that the will cannot be contested. Mr. Calhoun also left a separate letter for the heiress. And speaking of which, where is she?" The notary glanced around the room, scrutinizing the relatives seated at the table. Meanwhile, Carly was tidying up her apartment, as she was starting her new job at the store the next day. Expecting to be busy for the next few days, Carly decided to clean in advance. Suddenly the doorbell rang. Dropping her wet rag on the floor, Carly went to answer the door. Standing in the doorway was a young man in a business suit. "Hello," he said to the girl. "I am an assistant notary entrusted by your grandfather, Mr. Calhoun, to handle his will. You are urgently needed at the reading. I've been instructed to bring you to the notary's office immediately. Please set aside your tasks for a while and come with me. Everyone is waiting." Carly's arrival caused a noticeable murmur of indignation among the relatives. The notary asked for silence. Once quiet, he said, "Mr. Calhoun has instructed me to read out a letter addressed to the heiress Carly in the presence of all relatives. This letter exists in written form and as a video recording where the deceased himself reads the text. Please familiarize yourself. My dear granddaughter Carly, I anticipate that this news may not bring you joy, and there are reasons for that. However, I have given it thorough thought before making this decision for the event of my death. Please know, I never doubted you for a second. I have always been convinced that you are the most deserving heir to my fortune. Consequently, I bequeath all my property, along with our family business, solely to you. I implore you not to reject this gift and not to succumb to the provocations of your new relatives. You are the only hope for our family business. I am aware that my time is limited, so I ask you earnestly to fulfill my last will. Do not doubt your abilities, and do not fear the challenges of managing such a significant and new responsibility. In the near future, my trusted associates and friends will reach out to you. They will provide you with guidance, collaborate with you closely, and lead our business while you continue your studies at the university. As for your siblings, Gia and Lucas, I have a task for you as well. Encourage them to join any of our businesses of their choice. It will be beneficial for them to start earning their own living. If they decline, do not force them. However, in such a case, Gia and Lucas will have to seek their means of survival. After you inherit, the only beneficiary will be my ex-wife Bella, due to her old age. Your half-brother and sister will no longer receive financial support. Fear nothing, my dear. I am confident that you can overcome any obstacle, no matter how daunting it may seem. I believe in you unconditionally. Your loving grandfather." The notary finished reading. A silence fell over the room. Everyone waited for the heiress's response. Carly cried inconsolably, unable to speak a word. "Well, the will has been announced," the notary concluded. "The heiress, Carly O'Donnell, will assume the rights of succession in accordance with the law. Now, I would ask everyone to sign."